Anne Scripps walked through the grand entrance of her family estate, the marble floors gleaming beneath her heels. The scent of fresh orchids mingled with the faint aroma of candle wax, casting the perfect illusion of a home untouched by trouble. She was dressed in a sapphire gown that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, the embodiment of elegance and wealth. Yet behind her poised smile, there was a loneliness she could never quite disguise. Friends and acquaintances admired her beauty and sophistication, but few knew the ache she carried, a yearning for love that was sincere, not transactional. That evening, the estate was alive with laughter and music. Guests moved through the rooms in carefully choreographed elegance, champagne flutes clinking, small talk punctuated by occasional laughter. Anne greeted each visitor with warmth, her laughter ringing clear and genuine. Yet, as the night progressed, she felt a subtle unease, like a shadow lurking just at the edge of her vision. She brushed it aside, blaming the stress of managing a sprawling estate and the demands of social obligations. Among the crowd, a man caught her eye, Michael Nizolik. He stood tall, with dark hair neatly combed, and a smile that seemed effortlessly charming. He approached her with the ease of someone used to being noticed, yet he carried an air of mystery that intrigued her. Their first conversation was casual, punctuated by polite laughter and the soft murmur of other guests in the background. He complimented her dress, her taste in art, and her philanthropic endeavors. Anne felt drawn to him in a way she had not felt in years. There was something about his gaze that suggested sincerity, though it was impossible to know whether it was genuine or carefully measured. Over the following weeks, their courtship grew. Michael was attentive, sending flowers, making grand gestures that spoke of admiration and devotion. Anne, who had grown wary after a difficult divorce, found herself slowly letting down the walls she had built around her heart. Friends noticed her happiness returning, the sparkle in her eyes that had dimmed for so long. Yet there were subtle warning signs that Anne tried to ignore. Michael had a habit of questioning her finances, occasionally pressing for details about her estate and personal wealth. He had unexplained absences that left her anxious and texting unanswered messages into the night. On more than one occasion, he displayed flashes of temper over minor disagreements, though he would later apologize with a sincerity that made her question her own instincts. One afternoon, Anne confided in her close friend, Linda, while they sat in the sunlit conservatory, the scent of jasmine drifting in from the open windows. "He's perfect," Anne said, though her voice carried a faint tremor. "And yet, sometimes I feel like I don't know him at all, like there's something he's not telling me." Linda reached for her hand. "Anne, you're wonderful, but don't let anyone control you. Pay attention to the little things. Sometimes those are the signs we ignore until it's too late." Anne smiled, but the words lingered like a whisper she tried not to hear. That night, as she locked the doors and prepared for bed, she glanced at a family portrait hanging above the fireplace, a reminder of the life she had inherited and the people who had shaped her. She couldn't shake a creeping sense that the sanctuary she had known was no longer entirely safe. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's presence in Anne's life became more consuming. He was charming to outsiders, but increasingly possessive behind closed doors. He offered to manage aspects of her estate, ostensibly to help, but Anne noticed the way he scrutinized every financial decision, every interaction she had with friends and staff. He would disappear for hours, returning with vague explanations, his eyes sometimes flashing with impatience when she questioned him. And yet he was kind, attentive, and affectionate at other times, a duality that left her confused, questioning her own perceptions. One evening, Anne attended a charity gala, Michael at her side. He complimented her as she spoke with guests, whispered reassurances when she felt self-conscious, and guided her through the crowded room with careful attention. But as the night progressed, a subtle tension built. Michael's hand lingered a little too long on her arm, his gaze tracking her interactions with other men in a way that made her uncomfortable. She forced herself to smile, excusing the discomfort as mere jealousy, though deep down a flicker of fear began to grow. Back at the estate, the quiet of the night was both comforting and ominous. Anne wandered through the empty halls, the polished wood floors echoing beneath her steps. She passed by the drawing room, where a fire crackled gently in the hearth, and paused at a window overlooking the gardens. The moonlight cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. She tried to convince herself it was just imagination, but the unease remained. It was during these quiet moments that Anne began to notice small discrepancies. Michael's stories didn't always match, and he seemed defensive when she asked simple questions about his day. A letter arrived at the estate in his handwriting, but the tone seemed off, almost rehearsed. These little things, which might have seemed insignificant to others, gnawed at her mind. Her intuition, long a silent companion, began to raise alarms she could not ignore. Despite the tension, Anne's desire for love and connection outweighed her fear. She allowed herself to hope, imagining a future with Michael filled with happiness, companionship, and shared dreams. Yet the shadows at the edges of her life grew darker, foreshadowing the tragedy that would soon unfold. Each smile, each tender gesture carried a tension that hinted at the duality she was beginning to recognize. Love intertwined with danger, devotion laced with control. Anne's world, once filled with light and laughter, began to feel increasingly constricted. Michael, once the charming gentleman who had entered her life with effortless grace, was now revealing layers she hadn't anticipated: possessive, demanding, and increasingly controlling. At first, she tried to rationalize his behavior. Perhaps it was the stress of blending their very different lives, she thought. Or maybe his intensity was simply the price of the passion he promised. But over time, the inconsistencies, the small manipulations, and the subtle threats could no longer be ignored. One evening, Anne returned home from a late-night charity event. The estate was silent, the opulent halls bathed in the soft glow of wall sconces. As she placed her coat on the stand, she noticed a note slipped under the door. It was from Michael. The message was affectionate on the surface, yet there was an undercurrent of impatience, a reminder that he expected her attention, compliance, and gratitude. Anne crumpled the paper in her hand, a chill creeping over her. She could no longer ignore the feeling that she was navigating a minefield, each step fraught with invisible danger. Michael's presence in her life became increasingly invasive. He questioned her financial decisions, insisting that she consult him before taking even the simplest actions. He monitored her interactions with friends, making subtle comments that sowed seeds of doubt about their loyalty or intentions. If Anne tried to assert herself, he would become distant, his silence cutting deeper than any argument. On the surface, he was affectionate, generous, and attentive, yet beneath that veneer lay a simmering volatility that Anne could no longer deny. Anne confided in her closest friend, Linda, during a quiet afternoon in the conservatory. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the vibrant greenery that Anne had painstakingly cultivated. "Linda," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I'm imagining things, but sometimes I feel like he's watching me, even when he says he isn't. And the way he asks about my money, it's not normal." Linda's brow furrowed. "Anne, you're brilliant and kind, but this isn't about money. It's about control. You need to listen to that feeling inside you. It's telling you something you can't ignore." Anne wanted to believe her friend, but denial remained a powerful force. Love, she thought, should be enough to forgive, to overlook flaws, to endure moments of discomfort. Yet the more she tried to reconcile the man she loved with the man she frightened, the more impossible it became. The tension escalated during a quiet weekend at the estate. Anne had invited friends for a small gathering, hoping to maintain a sense of normalcy and enjoyment. Michael, ostensibly charming to the guests, displayed a subtle but undeniable edge. He questioned Anne's friends about their backgrounds, their finances, and their motives for attending. When Anne laughed at a harmless joke, he glared, muttering something under his breath about attention being drawn away from her. After the guests departed, the confrontation that Anne had long feared arrived. Michael cornered her in the study, his expression alternating between concern and barely contained anger. "Anne," he said, his voice low, "you need to understand. I can't stand it when you're not thinking of me first. You have so many people around you, so many distractions. I need to know you're mine." Anne's heart raced. "I am yours," she whispered, unsure whether the words were true or simply an attempt to placate him. I just, I have a life too. I have friends, obligations." Michael's eyes hardened. "Your life, your friends, they don't matter, not like I do. You promised me you'd prioritize us, and I see you drifting away, Anne. I see it." It was the first time she recognized the danger clearly. The man she loved was becoming a threat, not to her wealth, not to her lifestyle, but to her very sense of safety. She thought about fleeing, leaving the estate, returning to a life of independence, but she hesitated. Fear, love, and hope were tangled into a knot too complex to untangle. Over the next few weeks, Michael's behavior became more unpredictable. Late-night visits, angry outbursts, and possessive demands intensified. Anne began to notice bruises, subtle marks that she would excuse with clumsy explanations, tripping over furniture, bumping into doors. But deep down, she knew they were not accidents. The mansion that once symbolized security had begun to feel like a gilded cage. Even the staff at the estate noticed the change. Servants whispered in corridors, exchanging uneasy glances when Michael was around. One housekeeper mentioned seeing him pacing outside Anne's room in the middle of the night, his shadow stretching long under the dim moonlight. Another reported hearing raised voices, Anne pleading softly, her tone edged with fear. Yet the evidence was circumstantial, and Anne herself resisted acknowledging the danger fully. Friends urged Anne to confront the reality, to leave, to protect herself. "You have everything to lose, Anne," Linda said one evening, her voice filled with urgency. "This isn't just jealousy or moodiness. He's dangerous, and you need to act before it's too late." Anne nodded, her stomach twisting. She wanted to believe her friend, but she also wanted to believe in Michael, in the man who had promised devotion and passion. The contradiction tore at her. How could someone who made her feel so alive also make her feel so threatened? The narrative heightened suspense further when neighbors began noticing unusual activity. A car parked outside the estate at odd hours, lights flickering in rooms when Anne was supposed to be alone, shadows moving past windows. Whispers spread in the small community, concern, speculation, and fear, but no one could intervene directly. The tension was palpable. Anne's luxurious life was becoming a trap, her home a stage for subtle but growing terror. The night began quietly at the Scripps estate, but the calm was deceptive. Outside, a crisp wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint rustle of leaves across the manicured lawns. Inside, the lights of the mansion glimmered, casting shadows that stretched along the ornate walls. Anne had prepared dinner alone that evening, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the growing tension that had shadowed her life for weeks. Michael arrived later than usual, slipping in quietly through the grand entrance. At first, he appeared calm, almost charming, with that familiar smile that had once drawn Anne to him. But there was a subtle rigidity in his posture, a cold precision in the way he moved through the room. Anne sensed immediately that the evening would not unfold as expected. They began with polite conversation over dinner, a facade of civility stretched over a simmering tension neither could fully mask. Michael's questions were pointed, probing not just about her day, but about her relationships, her interactions, and even the smallest details of her finances. Anne responded cautiously, her voice measured, her smile tight. She could feel the growing pressure, the invisible lines being drawn around her, restricting her freedom even in the familiar safety of her own home. After dinner, as they moved to the drawing room, the veneer of calm shattered. Michael's voice, once a soothing baritone, now carried an edge of accusation. "Anne, you can't keep avoiding me. I see the way you interact with others. I see everything," he said, his dark eyes flashing. The air in the room thickened with tension. Anne's stomach twisted. She had known this night would come. She had feared it, anticipated it, but nothing could prepare her for the intensity of the confrontation. "I'm not avoiding you," Anne said, her tone calm but firm. "I've been trying to live my life. I can't live only for you." Michael's expression darkened, his hands clenching on the arms of the sofa. "That's exactly it, Anne. You think this is just about your life, your friends, your money, but it's not. It's about us. I need you to be mine completely." His voice dropped lower, almost a growl, and a chill ran down Anne's spine. The argument escalated quickly. Words became sharper, voices louder, and the quiet mansion was filled with echoes of anger and fear. Anne tried to retreat to the hallway, to distance herself from the growing menace, but Michael blocked her path, his presence suddenly overwhelming. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves pressed in around them. Anne's mind raced. She thought of the bruises she had tried to explain away, the late-night pacing she had noticed through slightly ajar doors, the subtle but constant manipulation that had shadowed their relationship. Everything pointed to danger, yet she was trapped, cornered in the space that had once been her sanctuary. Michael advanced, his anger now fully unleashed. "You don't understand, Anne. You can't just live for yourself. You promised." "I never promised to be yours in this way," Anne cried, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I loved you, I still do, but I won't be controlled." The confrontation reached its tragic apex in an instant. A struggle ensued, chaotic and desperate. Anne fought with all her strength, her nails scratching, her body twisting to escape, but Michael's force was relentless. The beautiful, polished floors became a battlefield of desperation. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across the room, highlighting the horror unfolding below. In the frenzied chaos, a knife, sharp, cold, and final, entered the scene. Anne's eyes widened in terror as the inevitable unfolded. The struggle was brief but intense. A single, fatal stab ended the battle. Her life, once full of warmth, love, and promise, was extinguished in the shadows of her own home. The house fell silent again, the only sound the faint ticking of a distant clock. Michael stood over her, breathing heavily, a mixture of rage and disbelief in his expression. He quickly realized that the gravity of his actions had irreversibly altered everything. Panic began to set in. He moved to conceal evidence, wiping surfaces, placing objects back in their places, attempting to craft a narrative that could withstand the scrutiny of the world outside. But the meticulousness was flawed. The signs of violence were undeniable, the absence of Anne too glaring to ignore. Neighbors, drawn by faint cries and the unusual absence of light in the drawing room, began to whisper among themselves. The estate, once a symbol of wealth and elegance, now radiated a sense of unease. Someone had intruded upon the safety of this home, not a stranger, but the very man Anne had trusted. By the following morning, the tragedy had become undeniable. Emergency responders arrived at the estate, greeted by the stunned faces of staff and neighbors. The police quickly identified the scene as a homicide, and Michael, whose charm yet once disarmed, now seemed like a figure of suspicion. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, was scrutinized under the weight of the law. Detectives began piecing together the timeline, the inconsistencies in Michael's story quickly surfacing. Witness statements, the location of objects in the house, and small but telling forensic details painted a portrait of premeditation. Michael's prior behavior, manipulation, possessiveness, and aggression suddenly framed him not just as a lover, but as a predator. Anne's friends and family were engulfed in shock and grief. They struggled to comprehend how a woman so vibrant, kind, and full of life could be taken in such a brutal and intimate way. The community, too, reeled from the news. A tale of wealth, romance, and promise had descended into horror and betrayal. In the weeks following the murder, investigators meticulously reconstructed the events of that night. Michael's movements were traced, his interactions scrutinized, and his motives questioned. Evidence mounted, each piece reinforcing the narrative of a calculated betrayal cloaked in charm. The world saw a man who had loved and lost, or at least appeared to, but behind the facade was a chilling orchestration of control, rage, and greed. The morning after Anne Scripps' death, the estate was a scene of grief and disbelief. Police officers and forensic teams moved through the rooms with meticulous precision, cataloging every piece of evidence, every anomaly that might reveal the truth. The mansion, once a symbol of elegance and wealth, was now a cold and haunting shell of the life Anne had built. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and candle wax, mingling with the lingering traces of a struggle that had ended a life. Michael Nizolik had been taken into custody shortly after emergency responders arrived. His charming demeanor had vanished, replaced by a calculated calm that barely concealed panic. Detectives began their interrogations, cross-referencing statements, timelines, and physical evidence. Every step Michael took, every word he uttered, became part of a larger picture slowly emerging, one of deception, betrayal, and premeditated violence. Anne's friends and family were plunged into mourning, struggling to reconcile the vibrant woman they had loved with the tragic reality of her death. Her mother, once a figure of refined composure, sat quietly in the family library, surrounded by photographs and mementos of Anne's life. "She was so full of life," her mother whispered, tears streaming. "And now it's gone, taken in a way that feels impossible to understand." The investigation revealed Michael's pattern of manipulation and control, corroborated by witness statements, financial records, and forensic evidence. Detective James Callahan, tasked with leading the case, carefully pieced together the events of the fateful night. Every detail mattered: the bruises Anne had sustained, the knife found at the scene, the discrepancies in Michael's alibi. The picture that emerged was chilling. Michael had not acted in a moment of uncontrolled rage. He had calculated, cornered, and ultimately killed the woman who trusted him. As the evidence mounted, Michael's defense began to unravel. His attempts to charm officers, staff, and neighbors could not withstand the scrutiny of forensic analysis. Investigators uncovered messages, phone records, and prior altercations that painted a consistent pattern of control and obsession. Each piece of evidence reinforced the narrative of betrayal that had haunted Anne the months leading up to her death. The trial, when it began, was a media spectacle. Reporters crowded the courthouse, cameras flashing as the public hung on every word. The prosecution painted Michael as a man who used charm and seduction as weapons, manipulating Anne into a sense of safety even as he plotted her demise. Witnesses described the escalating tension in the relationship, recounting the moments of fear, the bruises, and the subtle manipulations that Anne had endured. Michael's defense attempted to frame the murder as a crime of passion, a single moment of uncontrolled rage by a man who had loved Anne. But the prosecution dismantled this narrative with precision, presenting forensic evidence that contradicted his story, financial records showing a motive rooted in greed, and a timeline that suggested premeditation. The courtroom became a battleground of truth versus deception, with Anne's life and memory at the center. Throughout the trial, Anne's family took an active role, ensuring that her legacy was honored and that justice was pursued relentlessly. Their testimony was poignant and heartfelt, painting a portrait of Anne as not just a victim, but as a woman of warmth, intelligence, and generosity. Friends and colleagues spoke of her charitable work, her dedication to community, and the love she had shared with those around her. These testimonies humanized Anne for the jury, reminding them that she was more than a headline or a tragic figure. She was a life lost too soon. As the weeks of testimony unfolded, tension in the courtroom remained high. Michael's every action was scrutinized, every word analyzed. The prosecution highlighted inconsistencies in his statements, his calculated attempts to appear remorseful, and his prior behaviors that revealed a pattern of manipulation. The jury was presented with a portrait of a man who used charm as a mask for malice, a predator hidden beneath the guise of devotion. In the final arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to consider the totality of evidence, the meticulous planning, the abuse of trust, the calculated steps leading to Anne's death. This was not a moment of uncontrolled anger, the lead prosecutor intoned. This was betrayal. This was murder, and justice demands accountability. Michael's defense attempted one last appeal to emotion, emphasizing his purported remorse and attempting to cast doubt on the timeline of events. But the jury, confronted with overwhelming evidence and the moving testimonies of Anne's loved ones, found little credibility in his claims. The verdict, when it came, was swift. Michael Niziolek was found guilty of murder in first degree. The courtroom was silent as the judge pronounced the sentence, the weight of justice settling heavily over all present. Relief and sorrow intertwined among Anne's family and friends. Relief that justice had been served, sorrow for the loss that could never be undone. In the aftermath of the trial, the community reflected on the lessons of Anne's life and death. News outlets highlighted her charitable work, her contributions to the arts, and her devotion to family and friends. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of manipulation hidden behind charm, the risks of ignoring subtle warning signs, and the tragic consequences that can result from love turned deadly. Anne's family worked to preserve her memory, establishing foundations in her name and promoting awareness about domestic abuse and manipulation. Friends remembered her for her kindness, intelligence, and the light that she had brought into their lives. Though the shadow of tragedy lingered, Anne's legacy endured, a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of the human spirit. Michael's incarceration marked the end of one chapter, but left lasting ripples throughout the lives he had touched and the community that had been shocked by his betrayal. The mansion, once alive with laughter and light, became a somber symbol, a place where beauty and terror had collided, and where the memory of Anne Scripps would forever linger.